That was Emmanuelle Vaugh Lee, documentary filmmaker. His focus is spiritual ecology. His father, Llewellyn Vaugh Lee, a Sufi teacher, and running a Sufi center in Northern California. It was fascinating. I loved how he was describing the subject matter of his films, and I will make every effort to watch at least some of them. I guess most stuff now, Phil, is online somewhere once it's made.
Yeah, or a lot of things are, so still most, a lot of documentaries are proprietary, because they're made under the auspices of PBS or HBO or whatever, but eventually, they become accessible.
Right.
So it's great.
It's interesting. He mentioned in the interview about during our generation how Eastern knowledge came to the West. Of course, that was the subject matter of your book, American Veda. And now he was posing the question, sort of, what does his generation do with that knowledge, and how do they utilize it in a way that'll be beneficial, for people, for the environment, for everything. Is that something that you have given a lot of thought to yourself, because you sort of are the expert on what took place, and I would think you have some very deep insights of what might be happening going forward.
Yeah, well, I that's too flattering, but I think his assessment of the generational differences may be quite accurate. We've had spiritual activists on uh, before. We've had Marianne Williamson on
Right.
3 times, and Andrew Harvey and others, and they're of our generation, and they are among the people who have led the charge uh, to awaken our generation of spiritual practitioners from a certain degree of self-centeredness and narcissism, you could say, that entered in, where people were focused on their own spiritual development, and they were perhaps doing good things in the world, but it was not necessarily of a political or social activist nature, and that may just have been a reflection of the times, because people like, look, I'll just use myself as an example. When I was in college age or even after, I was a social activist. I was marching against the war in Vietnam and all that. When I became a spiritual person, I just, found the inner peace and the growth of consciousness to be so appealing and so refreshing, that I just wanted to dwell in that. And things changed after a while, and we focused on our lives and our spirituality. But now, we're in a crisis,
Right.
and a lot of people woke up in the last. It's not new. It's not just a Trump phenomenon. People like Marianne and Andrew, have been beating this drum for 10 or 15 years or more, and so has Llewellyn Vaugh Lee, especially around the environment. That spiritual people are living in the world, and we should not neglect our duties as citizens while cultivating our spiritual life. That we have to bring whatever gains we've made internally out into the world in some form or another. So I was very pleased to hear him say that the spiritual people of his generation are more socially aware.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's like you, I was a social activist, and then got frustrated, felt it wasn't going anywhere. Got
Right.
involved in spirituality. And so, if you want a green forest, you need green trees. I'll go inward and forget about the marching and everything else. But I think now we're at a point where maybe that was a good period, but now we have to do both. As Marianne Williamson said, if you want to sit down, you better be able to stand up, referring to people going inward, and then you got to demonstrate that humanity, that spirituality outwardly. And I think we're certainly at that point now. And I'm glad to see that there are folks like Emmanuel of the younger generation that are feeling that are moving ahead with that. And the torch has been passed. One other thing he said that was interesting was when he was growing up, he was immersed in this Sufi spirituality in his house, and it was like a meditation center, and he was doing it.
Yeah.
And then when he was around 14, he thought, I don't know if I have other things I want to do. I want to rebel a little bit. We had Claire Hoffman on, who wrote the book about
Yeah.
growing up in Fairfield, Iowa, in a spiritual community, and she was, gung ho into it. And then when she was around 14, same age, she started really questioning and challenging it. And I think in both cases, as they got older, in their 20s, 30s, whatever, they started reevaluating and thinking, okay, this is what was good about it. This is what was not good about it. Let me take the good and leave behind the not so good, and let me benefit my life with it. Let me educate my children in those things that are valuable. So it was interesting I felt a comparison there between the two.
Yeah, from what my memory, Emmanuel seems to have gone through that phase of rebellion and return earlier than Claire did. But it's not uncommon. I mean, in my research of, people, um, the dedicated spiritual people of our generation raise children, and like all, teenagers, they're going to start questioning their parents, and in some cases rebel. And that's what many of them do. And
Right.
some return or find their own path to, a different path than their parents to spirituality. Some reject the whole thing as, you know, fool's gold, and, go full bore into sex, drugs, and rock and roll or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And it's like teenagers of any other stripe.
Right, right.
Hope in the
It's
long run they
yeah.
do well.
Yep, you get the whole 9 yards there. One thing different these days is in our generation there was a much bigger generation gap. Some of the stuff we were involved in and were
True.
thinking and discussing and all, our parents really, really couldn't relate to. Whereas now I think if you're an adult and you have a teenager or a college student or whatever like that, even if they're doing stuff that's very out there, you have some greater ability. The gap is less. I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's less of a gap now.
Well, I think you're right. I think the difference between the baby boomers and the millennials, to use those kind of categories, their children, is less than it was between, the Great Depression and World War II generation and the baby boomers. I mean, because, the world had changed so radically. And, just think of it in terms of music. you know, People today can hear the rock and roll of the 60s and 70s, and it's not foreign to them,
Right.
even though they grew up with hip hop and all that. Whereas, people who, the baby boomer generation, there was a vast difference
Right.
between the sort of music their parents listened to and rock and roll.
Right.
And probably, and technologically, and the world was, really, it was a great upheaval. So maybe that helps account
Right.
for it.
Right. Interesting. One
On
last
the
thing.
other hand,
Yeah. One.
you
One.
know,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
One,
No,
one
I
thing
was
I
just
wanted to
saying.
ask you before I forgot, and that was, you seem to be familiar with that ceremony that he captured in one of what he's working on in a
Oh yeah.
documentary. What is that?
I can't say much about it. I just remember I took some anthropology classes back, when I was a student, and the Native Americans of the Northwest had this thing called the potlatch ceremony, and all the different tribes, there'd be these occasions when they would get together, and all I remember is it sounded like this fabulous ceremony of, togetherness and peace among different tribes. But there was a lot of food involved. And I was
Ah.
thought
Uh-huh.
brought this great food, and I'd like to know more about it, or refresh my memory of it. But I would love to actually see his film, because I only read about it. But it was so appealing to me at the time, as this great, sort of communal oneness. We think of Native Americans as being, homogenous, but there's a tremendous diversity among them, and tribes were tribes, and they would come together on these occasions. Oh,
Amazing.
a lot of it was food.
Interesting. Well, I look forward to uh, watching some of his documentaries, and hopefully they're available online. Well, Phil, till next time.
Okay, my friend.
All right, over and out.